Alrighty, so today's video is going to be all about honing your testing process with the release of Twilight of the Republic. I'm going to be doing a pretty deep dive on kind of how the meta has solidified around certain pillars and then how we can start targeting those pillars. And then we'll also talk a little bit of Twilight of the Republic, what I'm looking at, just some ideas to get you going. All right, before we start, please hit that subscribe button. It helps out a lot. And do check out the Patreon if you're looking for some more content from me. Just had a pretty big update recently for a lot of Twilight Republic decks. All right. So first off, this is kind of the table of contents. We're going to be talking about the format pillars. This will be less deck list specific. It's more about the tension points, which is kind of the segue here. What certain decks present and what are these like problem cards or problem like issues that these decks give you, and like how you can start maneuvering your deck building to account for these things. We'll talk a little bit about some outsider success into this meta, which recently happened. Talk a little bit about how I would approach starting testing new decks, and then last, pretty big section, we'll be looking at Twilight of the Republic, a couple leaders there, some card callouts, but overall mechanic review and how that might fit in to the new meta. All right, format pillars. It starts here, of course, with Boba Fett. He is a format pillar for a lot of reasons. Stats, right? He is the biggest leader per cost in the game, not close. He's a 4/7, bigger than most 6 cost, or on par with most 6 cost leaders, bigger than all leaders at his own cost. He also creates this very huge turn on his flip turn where he can often generate 8 resources on the 5 resource turn. Pair that with ramp, for instance, which is the Boba Green shell, and you can do that on turn 3. So your opponent could be playing on 4 resources when you play on 8 on that turn. So when you think about how do I maneuver against Boba Fett, you have to be able to understand that that tension point can exist. If you are not a ramp deck, if you yourself do not ramp into a Boba, your flip turn, or your 4 resource turn could be their 8 resource turn, or if you're playing against like a mono yellow Boba, your 5 resource turn could be their 8 resource turn. Are you able to keep yourself sane during that process and alive, or do you get run over? Then we have to talk about the all-star supporting cast. Another reason Boba is such a pillar is that he has probably the 2 best leader call-out cards in the game. There are a few others in the game that exist. They're mostly lightsabers or equipment that comes with leaders. Like we know Ahsoka and Grievous both got a call-out card in their starter sets. It happened with Mandalorian and Moff Gideon. But none of these cards come even remotely close to Boba's armor and fire spray in terms of pure power level. And Boba's armor specifically is the one that I kind of want to talk about as a pillar, because a lot of decks can't beat this card. A lot of decks just lose if this ever hits the table and is equipped to Boba Fett. And those decks can't really enter a format right now when Boba Fett is as prominent as he is. Ways to target this have often been either being able to one-shot Boba before he gets it on. So think villain blue decks have been able to do stuff like that, or sometimes they're able to one-shot him the turn after because Rival's Fall does exist. Other ways, Force Throw, right? That's a card that we'll talk about a little later with the outsider success, but that is a way to one-shot him before he gets the armor on. And then kind of ignoring it and being better at aggro, like Sabine. And Sabine does also have a way to one-shot this because those decks run Poe and Energy Conversion Lab, and Poe can one-shot a Boba through a Boba's armor by blowing up the upgrade. So you can see the decks that kind of survived this Boba armor onslaught, and they're all decks that have ways to kind of beat him through it. If you want to try to beat him by preventing it, then targeted discard can sometimes work, but that is a very thin line to try to get through this, right? If you play something like Spark of Rebellion and you don't draw Spark of Rebellion and they draw Boba's armor and you have no other way of interacting with this, right? So it's either get under him and aggro him or have ways to beat it. But Boba's armor, like more so than Fire Spray, is an incredible card. It's one of the best cards in the game. But the way you beat that is less specific than Boba's armor. And Boba's armor also comes down earlier, and it just solidifies how immense of a threat the leader is in this deck, not just because of his stats, but because of the fact that he becomes near unkillable if he gets equipped with this. So the last part is the good in all colors here. So he is, right? I mean, Boba Green and Yellow were the two most popular and most successful in the PQ season leading up to set 3. Boba Red also had some strong finishes. Boba Blue, by far the least popular, had some decent finishes, but I wouldn't say it's yet the pillar. But he's good in all colors, and all these decks play quite differently, which is another difficult thing, right? Boba's not one thing. It's not, you don't just counter Boba by countering Boba, because all these decks play differently and all require different answers. But they still, mostly with the exception of Blue, revolve around him being really well statted, coming out so quick and generating a massive flip turn, and having Fire Spray and Boba's armor for that matter, right? So we start here. This is not actually the first place I would start testing against. We'll talk about that a little later. But it's the most important thing to think about in deck building is, do you stand a chance against these different levels of like what Boba presents? Next pillar, Ecl Wrecker. So you notice I don't even call this Sabine, although this is highlighted by Sabine. But the pillar here is Ecl, really. It's how good that card is with the red hero shell. Even in set 1, Sabine Green was one of the best decks, and it didn't have Wrecker or Poe for that matter. It had K2, it played Steadfast Battalion, which was kind of like the Wrecker adjacent card at the time for Sabine, right? The big guy that overwhelms. But Poe and Wrecker created a whole new dynamic for this deck, and Wrecker specifically being a card that can usually create a 3-for-1 while also dealing something between 4 and 6 damage to his opponent's base in one action, really is a tension point for a lot of decks. And you have to know, you have to like run whatever brew, whatever non-brew, whatever pile of cards you're playing, have to be able to contend with this to some degree. It's a big reason why even some strategies that might be good into Boba have a hard time ever succeeding, because a lot of the time something, let's say Palpatine, right? Although Palpatine's not necessarily great into Boba right now, but it's a good example of a deck that has quite a lot of innate power. And Palpatine is a massive leader with massive potential, but his matchup into Ecl Wrecker is abysmal, and he really gets pushed out of meta contention because of that. Sabine is the shell, right? She is the best version of this because 4 cost deploy. We talked about how good Boba coming out of 5 is. Sabine coming out of 4 is nuts, right? That's turn 3. That without ramping, right? That's incredible. Her stats are good enough to protect her from basically everything that's in play at the time, right? With 5 health. I think a big reason we don't see Kylo and maybe Asajj soon really break through is because that 4 health is such a liability compared to 5. Sabine also, there are other benefits to her being rebel traded and getting some really good rebel payoffs there, and like something like Darksaber. But in reality, I still think a red-green hero aggro shell would succeed without Sabine. So it's why I kind of don't talk about this pillar as being a Sabine pillar. I talk about being an Ecl hero red pillar highlighted by Wrecker. So you have to account for this, and you need to be thinking about these pain points that this deck and strategy present. The third pillar, this one's not too difficult to talk about or too time consuming. It's Han and DJ. Is this a tech related problem? It is not. Tech is a good card, but it is not what the pillar of this deck is. it's what makes the deck very good, but what a lot of decks cannot deal with, regardless of tech, is a turn 4 DJ, which can happen basically any game, right? Any game Han draws DJ on turn 4, Han can resource, flip, attack, DJ from the row, not even using a card from their hand, blow, ending up with a scenario where they get it to ramp and blow up one of your resources. So the next turn starts, and all of a sudden they're at 7 and you're at 5, and big problems ensue, right? Any leader usually that deploys after Han has a really hard time of beating this deck because of this DJ interaction. It is a very safe interaction. It's not very difficult to pull off. A lot of decks can't just sit there and hold 4 or 5 resources just to wait for this DJ to come out so that they can use removal or use some ambush unit to kill it. Because, you know, if you're doing that and you're just pass, and Han attacks you and then they have 7 resources, they don't have to play DJ. They can do other things too, right? So can your deck beat this one interaction? I'm not talking about the whole deck. The whole deck is very good. It has other really good qualities to it. It's a very aggressive deck. It has a lot of hand disruption abilities, which helps protect this DJ combo even more. But the thing that I think separates it and puts it as a pillar is this DJ interaction that your deck has to account for. And it's not hard to test into this. Just play a few games and see if like, just tell your Han opponent you draw DJ this turn and see if you can beat it. Like, see if you have a way to maneuver a turn where they don't blow up one of your resources and ramp, because a lot of decks basically lose on the spot if that happens. And this is very, very like a clean game for Han. It does not require much for them to be able to DJ you on that turn. Yeah. So another thing that I would say needs to be tested in and like heavily vetted. And finally, the Ramp Barrage cheap leader pillar. So this, interestingly enough, kind of also plays into the Boba pillar because the most popular Boba deck plays this shell of cards. But another successful strategy has been Blue-Green Villain, and they play this strategy as well. Even even Red-Green Villain, which is not popular this set but can play this strategy. A lot of things can play this strategy. A mono green deck can play this strategy. The important part is usually the ramp, the barrage, and a leader that you can flip on the barrage turn. So 5, usually a 5 deploy. This pushes out a lot, and it doesn't get as much like limelight because it's either adjacent to a Boba strategy, so it's like not talked about specifically there, because Boba's good in other things too, so this isn't what's carrying it technically. It's obviously a big reason why a Kira or a Krennic deck succeeds, but it also is a reason why a lot of decks can't succeed. A lot of decks can't beat this. They just, I'm looking right now, and we'll talk about this a little later, but like a go wide aggro strategy just usually basically loses on the spot to resupply into a leader flip barrage. It is a important thing that you need to like understand is going to be very popular among other decks, and that when you're building, it is part of your pillar of testing is going to be figuring out if you can beat the ramp barrage strategy. Of course, these decks don't always ramp and they don't always have barrage in their hand, but they do enough of the time for you to like have to say you can beat that to be competitive. All right. So in summary, the tension points. Boba's big, and he creates an 8 resource turn on turn 3 or turn 4. How do you deal, right? In addition to that, armor, right? Armor is this very blatantly powerful thing that if you don't have a way to deal with cleanly, and usually upgrade removal is not the clean way because, you know, they still have a massive leader. So that's kind of the difficulty here, is that like you can, yeah, like it's nice, you confiscate it, like you basically trade resources there, but it doesn't save you from the Boba. So fire spray as well, right? Wrecker's ECL is next pillar, which is kind of like the red hero aggro thing that is at its best in Sabine. DJ Han another pillar. It's a major pain point for a lot of decks, especially decks that play leaders that cost more than 5. And then lastly, the ramp Barrage pillar is usually in conjunction with a 5-cost leader deploy. All right, I want to talk about one outsider that kind of was able to become a top meta contender towards the end of this set's lifespan, and that was Ray Red. And how did it do it? How did it manage to answer these questions, right? Can start with Boba. Blue in general has some game into that. They have good removal. They're able to slow the game down. So often if you're able to slow the game down enough to get to things like Luke, for instance, Luke is one of the absolute best cards in the game against Boba. Really dominates those decks a lot of the time. So how do we bridge those gaps? Village Protectors has been a fantastic blue hero staple. A lot of built-in healing, which Rey does have. Now, she's a late deploy, and there is a tension there that sometimes that can struggle into like a Boba deck that ramps and like has Barrage to be able to one-shot her through Sentinels, or just puts too much pressure on her. But her Restore 3 ended up being absolutely nuts in a lot of situations, really able to undo a lot of like the falling behind that happens for Rey. So in addition to these blue things that are able to like stall Boba, which they do pretty well into Sabine too, this deck got to play Force Throw pretty well, and Force Throw is a bomb. It would be a format pillar if this was just played more, or like Force Throw decks in general. It is an incredibly powerful card, but it gets to do the thing that like Boba now can't just flip if you have one resource up and a force unit out. It really puts them into some difficult decisions. Very powerful, right? So with that and her ability to kind of like have built-in healing and to stem off Sabine aggro, right? Wouldn't say it was necessarily favored into these matchups, but I won't say it's unfavored either. I think Rey just had good game into them. I don't want to give you random statistics about how it was I don't know the win percentages it had. Let me say that. I know that it succeeded despite how much Sabine and Boba existed. So it clearly was fighting them pretty well. On top of that, the deck can kind of grind. Red gets a lot of discard, which definitely helps it into controlling strategies as well. So Rey, despite the odds kind of being against her, being a 6-cost deploy, being forced to play a bit of a slower game in a very fast format, was able to kind of break through. And this is what we need to try to recreate now, because very few other decks broke through in this way, right? I would say basically no other decks. There were like fringy one-offs and like top 8s and stuff, but like nothing to the degree that Rey was like repeatedly won some PQs, repeatedly made top 8s, that wasn't already playing some of those other pillar cards that we said, right? Like the Barrage pillar, the Han DJ pillar, the Boba pillar, the Sabine or the Ecl Wrecker pillar. So we need to think about like how Rey succeeded, and I mentioned a few of those reasons. And then in our testing, it doesn't mean just, let's just play Village Protectors and Force Throw on all our decks. It means, how did these cards help us fight into this stuff, right? They were able to slow down the game. They presented ways to one-shot leaders, all kind of things that together tied in to making this a very good meta contender. All right, so how do you start your testing, or how do I start my testing? Number one is theory, right? You start everything with just like an idea. Usually that's, I like this leader. There, that's an idea, right? Like this color. Bam. Now we open up, you see 300 cards, and it's time to figure out what we're trying to do. So you start usually thinking, I'm aggressive. Am I in the middle? Am I playing control, right? And we know we already have like a foundation from the previous 2 sets of like what cards operate well in those strategies. So we can start adding and getting like our strategy and a cohesive plan built in, right? Am I going to be aggressive deck? I'm going to have lower cost units. I'm going to have ways to close the game, maybe some reach, right? Control. I'm going to have the answers, right? I'm going to have ways to beat these early leaders, ways to defeat them, ways to stall them, ways to heal. Once you have your theory, your idea, you have to make a deck, right? And this is the hard part, and this is not going to be a crash course on deck building, but it is add a bunch of cards, right? And usually what I do is I add a bunch, and I don't remove a bunch. I just put everything that I'm not playing with in a sideboard, like and just start thinking about other cards, like play some games, move sideboard cards in, move things out. Anything I would even remotely consider just goes into this maybe board, right? It's not we're not at sideboarding yet. We're not prepping for a tournament. We're just theory crafting. So we're building, we're looking at different cards. Sometimes look at like something way out of left field, something very different than what you're normally used to playing. Some cards that you may have never even considered. Just look at them. They might work in a different shell. But once you have a list, it's time to start testing. And honestly, the first place I would start if I'm like actively trying to build something for meta contention, right? Tournament prep. It would be playing against Sabine. It's not because I think it's the most prominent pillar. I just think it's the easiest one to vet against. The games are quicker, and you kind of know pretty quickly, I think, in my experience, whether your deck can beat it at any significant rate. They go quick, and it's pretty blatant how they win, right? Like, is it turn 5 and you're dead every game, and like just nothing you would have drawn is going to help you? You kind of know, right? Think Palpatine, right? You just play 10 games and you maybe win one of them, and it's because you did like the perfect curve into double barrage. Well, every other game wasn't even close. Then you kind of get an idea. So you vet against Sabine. It doesn't mean you have to be favored here. Not every deck needs to be favored into Sabine, and not every deck will be. And doesn't mean it's not a good deck. Nothing's gonna be favored into everything, but I certainly wouldn't want like an auto loss here. Like I'd want to be able to say like this has some game, and once it does, if it doesn't, we go back up to build and iterate, right, back to step 2. But if it does pass that test, whatever threshold it is that you've set for yourself, then it's time to move on to Boba. And this is a little more difficult to test into because it's also a lot of different decks, and so sometimes not completely clear if you had a chance, right? I think it's more blatant when Sabine beats you, but Boba's next, and you have to really think about those flip turns and like, whoa, is this game just like over when they like ramp, flip, do an 8 resource turn, or even without ramp? Like when they have this 8 resource turn, do we never win? If they're able to stick armor, do we never win, right? Because you can play some games where maybe you're playing like a yellow discard strategy, and you just like spark an armor, and then like you claw through that flip turn and you win, and then great, right? But it doesn't mean that you're in a good spot if like the only way you can ever win is by like getting rid of that armor, or like having the exact lineup that lets you match that flip turn, and like they missed ramp for in a game, and like you won because you flipped on the same turn as them with a leader. You need to think about the more, like, you need to play enough that you can like see which games are the ones that you're losing. Are you losing every game that they ramp? Are you losing every game that they armor? Are you losing every game that they cunning you in the mono yellow? And that's when you'll start picking up details as to like, are you truly contending, or are you just winning the games where they aren't doing the powerful thing? Once you're done with these two, if it's not like, if you did the Sabine and then not great into the Boba, it's back to step 2, and we iterate again, and then we go through it again, right? Because any changes that you make, it could impact your matchup into Sabine, right? Usually any changes you make to beat other decks impact you against Sabine. It is kind of like the floor. There's a lot of cards in most decks that are just not really good in that matchup. So the more of those you start adding for other matchups, the worse you get into that Sabine. It's why you always have to kind of go back and double check yourself. But once we get past those two, and I would at the very least want to be probably favored into one of them. I think it's okay if maybe you're like only splitting games with one of them and maybe a little bit unfavored, as long as like everything else is looking good. But you have to set that line for yourself. But I think one of these two you need to be feeling pretty good with, and neither of them you should be feeling awful against. But after that, I would do the can you beat DJ. This one's really quick because either you can or you can't most of the time. A lot of decks can't, and they're usually later leader deploys. It's very tough to deal with this interaction. If this deck was more popular, we'd be hearing a lot more about this interaction than we are. But because the Han mono yellow deck, in my opinion, does not fare too great into Boba, and Boba is everywhere, I think that's what was keeping this from like really exploding in popularity. But rest assured, this is an incredibly powerful deck, and that is an incredibly powerful interaction. So I would make sure that you have game into that, or you just say whatever, right? Like you might not be able to fix this. A lot of decks cannot fix this interaction in gameplay. So can you beat DJ? And then control testing as well. It's usually the last thing I'll vet for, but you have to play into some control strategies, whether they're like the softer control decks like Blue Green Villain, or the harder control decks like the Bosk Blue that we saw, or Boba Blue. It's, though a lot of times decks end up having to sideboard a lot for these matchups, because it's like the same way Sabine is kind of like the floor, this is kind of the ceiling, and a lot of cards that are good into these other middle strategies are pretty bad here, and a lot of silver bullets or good cards against these strategies are pretty bad everywhere else. So often you have to kind of decide, am I more gearing my main deck for this control stuff or more for like the Sabine stuff, because often they clash very hard. So yeah, you vet through there, then back to step 2, right? Build and iterate, and you go through it. Like if you're really liking a deck, if you're really liking a strategy, you're just going to go through this process over and over and over again. But if at some point you hit a brick wall, like sometimes that just happens against Sabine for me. Like very often I'll just like make a deck and can't beat Sabine, and I change some stuff, go back, can't beat Sabine, change some stuff, go back, can't beat Sabine. All right, I usually put it away at that point, but you don't have to if you're okay with that outcome. So at any point during this process, if you're okay with the outcome, you're good to go, right? But keep working, keep iterating, and keep following trends, right? Like, and that's going to be important. I will try to continue to make guides and videos and stuff, and like on my Patreon, I will continue to have like deck lists that I am iterating on in conjunction with like how the meta develops. All right, next, and kind of the last section here will be the Twilight of the Republic. It's like early insight. I just want to do a little bit here, just some stuff that I've started to work on or have seen other people work on, and talk a little bit about this set and like how I think it might end up interacting with the current meta. So start with Exploit, which is a very powerful mechanic kind of innately. It's resource cheating. It's highlighted by 2 new leaders, Count Dooku and Nute Gunray. Both do it a little differently. Count Dooku's main thing is that he's going to give units that don't have exploit, right? So he's not going to exploit as much as Nute will, because he's not going to create as much fodder, but he'll have some more powerful units that he can use, because he doesn't have to rely on, frankly, a bunch of draft cards as his exploit target, right? Nute needs to play the commons that have exploit on them, or the uncommons, because it just doesn't have as many options. But Nute, on the other hand, just gives you a lot of food, right? So both really interesting leaders. I think both are solid. So far, I'm not finding good ways for this deck to interact favorably with Sabine. It is, as I said in the previous slide, mostly where I start my testing. These are expensive leaders, a 7 and a 6 cost deploy, and even the 6 cost deploy here, he is not a real body when it comes to stabilizing. So the games that I've been able to do decent into Sabine usually revolve around doing something like an early Malevolence, because you've been able to set up a bunch of tokens and then like follow that up with a Barrage to really wipe the board. But most games that don't involve that interaction haven't felt very good for me yet. But there is engine stuff, and especially in Nute, which is really interesting. Like, it's very easy to kind of just keep churning. They gave us enough tokens, specifically in green. I would like to have tried this in some other colors, but I'm having a hard time seeing enough enablers, because green, they gave us Confederate Courier, but they also gave us Poggle. There's Cobb Vanth from the previous set, which is a very good churner. He can sometimes become 3 units, right? Because he can die into a unit that then dies into a unit. So you get a lot of food in green, and Dooku has that built into him, but Newt doesn't. It doesn't mean that like not done exploring other colors. It's just like where so far I felt like the most tension with exploit is that you need enough of these early food, right? Enough of these generators, and blue green is where mostly they are located. I think both of these could be very interesting, and continue to try to get that aggro matchup better, because that is, again, for me, I don't want to really proceed hard into like the Boba vetting and the control vetting and the Han vetting until I have Sabine at a more respectable place. So far, that's where I'm at with this, but for sure, if you've found some good avenues for Sabine, feel free to let me know, or just keep doing it and go win some stuff with this. But exploit's a powerful mechanic, definitely the one I'm way more interested in this set, but so far still feels like it's not quite there in comparison to what has already been established. Next, Coronate / go wide, right? The other main mechanic from this set. Now, Coronate, I don't think is a very good mechanic. Not because I think Coronate on it like intrinsically isn't powerful. Like, I don't think having 3 units out to get a buff is the problem. In fact, I see that you can often do that, especially with cheaper leaders like Captain Rex and Ahsoka. I think most of the issue is that the cards that get buffed just aren't very powerful most of the time. Plo Koon is probably the best, and he's very good, and I don't think you need to play him in a Coronate deck. You just play him with another cheap leader, and usually you can get that Coronate Raid 3 set up. But most of the cards that have Coronate on their text become generally on rate cards with Coronate, and that I think sets it a bit back. Even Aayla Secura here, which I think is considered a pretty good card, I'm mostly just seeing a card that is only ever playable with Energy Conversion Lab, and even then is just okay. I honestly don't know if this card would be busted if it just had that on attack trigger without the Coordinate. But having said that, this is like one of the premier ones, and even if it is good enough, I think a lot of the issue with Coronate is that most of them aren't. Ahsoka is a cool leader. Unfortunately, she shares a color with Sabine, and I think for the most part, she is going to be a slightly lesser version of playing a Sabine ECL deck, especially if you pair her with green. There are options of playing her with other colors. I think the main draw for her is her lightsaber, which is a very powerful card. It's like a mini surprise strike that leaves up a permanent buff on her, and then you don't even have to attack with her. Ahsoka's cool. We'll try some other angles for aggro with her, especially going wide, but here's the issue with go wide. We talked about it in the Barrage pillar. You got a lot of low health units. You can really get majorly board wiped by an overwhelming Barrage pretty early in a game before you're really able to take off. So a little difficult. Captain Rex, on the other hand, he's cool because he kind of like self-enables any of the Coordinate. But again, he seems a little slow, but I like his health buff. That is one thing that helps against something like Barrage, is that he can pump their health. Unfortunately, it's not permanent, right? So they can still kill him, and then all those units that had damage will die. But these are kind of the highlights for the Coordinate strategy. This is like where mostly I think if you're trying to do a heavy Coordinate or go wide build, you'd go, unless of course we're talking villain, where Wat Tambor can kind of like do this. He can also kind of mix in a little with exploit, especially because his buff works when things die, but you want a lot of units in play so that he has targets for his buff, and you want things to die. So in that case, go wide kind of makes sense for him. You don't get Coordinate really because none of the villain stuff has Coordinate, but it still kind of fits into this go wide idea. Now he can really pump out a bunch of damage, but again, could have issues racing, because these go wide strategies, not just one, but all of them are very, very action intensive and almost always have to throw priority or initiative to their opponent because of that. They just have more units, so they're doing more actions, which means that it's slower for them to defeat their opponent, right? Your Wat Timbre deck could have 7 units in play representing 25 damage, and your opponent can have 2 units representing 13. And it doesn't matter that you can do more over 7 actions if they just kill you in 2 actions, because you need to attack for 2 every time and they can just hit you for 7 and 6. So that's kind of a little bit of an issue with the go wide in conjunction with the overwhelming barrage stuff that we talked about. And just one other card, Clear the Field, which I'll talk about a little later, also really hurts this token stuff. All right, a little bit on Quinlan, who I think is kind of a crowd favorite right now. He does have just like innate power. He's a 5-cost deploy 3/7. He can pair with, now there are 2 of them, which is a cool card. So there's some play with that with him, and like yellow in general, being able to play like 2-cost Republic or Force units, and then being able to like play a 5-cost on turn 2 with this card. But this guy's being looked at in a lot of colors. Tarkin Town, I think, makes sense, right? Because you get free pings out of him. So if you can free ping on turn 1, Tarkin Town, really take control of the board. It's something similar that like a Cad Bane Tarkin Town was doing, and even something that Boba Red was doing. They were just playing like ISB agent to enable this, but very powerful mechanic to just be able to kill a turn 1 play. Red struggles a little bit with it, with something like Boba ramping, right? Because you're going to end up in a situation where you're on your 4 resource turn and they can do 8 resources worth of stuff. Your outs really at that point are mostly just discard, like sparking an armor, because you're going to have a very hard time dealing with a Boba. If he gets that on, you might also struggle more with getting a force throw off, this is a good color for that, but you rely on a couple yellow units that have force trait that are usually pretty easy to remove. And if you're only on 4 resources, you can't flip your leader to do the force throw. So some tension there with Boba. I think with Tarkin Town, though, you have decent game into Sabine because, again, kill their turn 1 play. You are also playing a low to the ground leader. You have aggression, so you can kind of race them after that a lot of the time. Energy Conversion Lab. This is mostly being like showcased, I think, as like an idea that Quinlan can now basically one-shot any leader because his ambush units, so things like on 4 resources modded cohorts, or even like the new Sabine unit that costs 4, both that attack for 4, but because of Quinlan's ability, even when he's not deployed, can do an extra damage to a 4-cost unit. So those are clean kills onto Sabine. At 5, you have Plo Koon. If he has Coronate, he can actually hit for 6+1 to a 5-drop. That's the magic 7 for Boba. Aayla Secura can do that as well with Energy Conversion Lab. So some good ways to like one-shot leaders, but there's a catch here, and that it doesn't usually line up, unfortunately, because they're not, the people playing against you are generally not just going to like flip their leader into 4 or 5 open resources. So it's not as clean and free as it might like appear on paper, is all I'm saying. This deck is basically a fair mid-range deck. Yellow green has a bunch of good cards, but it's not doing anything fundamentally broken. This is a strategy, yellow green, that was played a lot with Han previously. Now Han does do something kind of broken, right, because he resource cheats. Quinlan, on the other hand, the gimmick here, of course, is that all these ambush units, or paired with Energy Conversion Lab, can kind of do the 1-up and kind of create trade-ups, especially be able to one-shot leaders. But I think if that doesn't actually end up like becoming the reality, where like we make these decks in order to one-shot leaders, and then they kind of don't, because the actual gameplay scenarios where that would work don't really come up that often. Your opponent's going to have more actions to churn. They can play out cards, and you just kind of have to sit there and hold back resources. It's a big problem sometimes. So that is something that I think might end up causing problems for the ECL build. Not to say that it isn't a powerful idea and something that needs to be explored. And then blue, this one is mostly like a call out to like the Rey stuff. I think you can try to make like a Rey-ish shell, right? You can play Village Protectors, Yoda, Kanan, Obi-Wan, Luke, like all these cards that we know kind of work pretty well against Boba and have like this restoring stuff. But then instead of Rey, who is a stabilizing force, you have a leader that comes out earlier, right? And who could, in theory, create some interesting trading dynamics because of his extra ping. On top of that, you also get, now there are two of them, which I think of all these color pairs works the best with blue, because you have Luke, Obi-Wan as like good targets for this, as well as on turn 2 things like Plo Koon and Ki-Adi-Mundi. The one place that I'm kind of interested at looking at him is just because of how huge he is to play on turn 2. I don't think he's kind of a great card in general, but if you're going to play now, there are two of them. I think you need to like make sure that the card is going to go off and have good targets for it. So blue, I think, is also definitely in play here for something like Quinlan. I think he is going to be, at least initially, one of the more tested leaders, because of course there is just innate power to his 3/7 stat line at 5 deploy with a good ability, right? There's nothing like magical that needs to happen for him to be at least baseline good. Maybe some stuff needs to happen for him to be baseline great and like get into the next tier, but not too much for him to at least be playable or like solid. Yoda is the other one I want to talk about. So like, did Quinlan and Yoda mostly because they don't really fall into like the exploit coordinate stuff from this set. Yoda is another one that it has like kind of a very powerful built-in ability, especially because not only can you do the now there are two of them stuff with him, but he can do You're My Only Hope. So now you get like two cards that could potentially cheat resources. Of course, you have to play him with yellow if you're going to do both, but at least baseline you get one of them. And cheating resources is good. You got to do something unfair. You're playing a 7-cost leader. There's going to be major problems, and so far there appear to be some problems with this into Sabine, of course, right? It's a 7-cost deploy. You're basically, the game is usually decided either before you flip, right? Like either they're killing you or you've like somehow managed to stabilize and you flip, and you can like kind of just win from there on because you got like a restoring leader and you one-shot it, big thing. But it's a very slow strategy. It's a very action-intensive strategy, right? You need something to die, then you need to use his ability. So you do end up throwing initiative a lot with Yoda as well if you want to actually do the things that make him powerful, that filtering effect. But there is innate power here, and it's very interesting to build around, especially because he was given a support card that really lets him do something absurd, right? Like Luke on 5 resources, or Obi on 4, or even like on 3 you can do a 5, right? Ki-Adi-Mundi, or if you're playing in some other color like Plo Koon. It's cool stuff, right? Mono blue makes sense to me as well because of course you're playing a late game strategy. Let's just dig into the things that help us get there. Some stuff like vigilance, right? Is vigilance for 4 is kind of a bomb. Vigilance for 6, not so much often. Red is interesting as well. You can look at like the red Rey shell. You still get all those force units, and often the force throw in Rey was being enabled not by Rey herself, but by earlier units. So force, being able to play force throw in your deck, very powerful. You get some more targets for You're My Only Hope as well. Stuff like Mace Windu, Wrecker, Poe, if you're going that way. Usually Wrecker, probably not if you're trying to get to a 7-cost leader. But anyway, lastly, green. I mean, green you would go if you want to ramp. I mean, you're playing a 7-cost leader. We got to check out if green helps. Unfortunately, villain has better ramp. Super Laser Tech is better than Spark of Hope. Spark of Hope's kind of clunky, but Yoda wants his units to die, so Spark of Hope can make sense, right? So we look at green as well. We're going to look at all these colors, or I am at least, and see if any of them can fit. And then we vet against Sabine over and over again, because of course, as a 7-cost leader, you should be good late in the game. But if you have too much problems with Sabine, something that like Palp has had to date, now maybe Palp will be able to fix that matchup this set, but at least for now, we know that these really late deploys have not yet been able to solve the Sabine matchup. So Yoda gets another crack at it, and we'll see if cheating resources with You're My Only Hope and this filtering can help get him there. All right, lastly, just some call outs. This is not really strategy specific, just some stuff I wanted to talk about. So like Darth Maul paired with Energy Conversion Lab, I think is a very powerful interaction, of course. For me, there seems to be some issue primarily in the early game with Red Green Villain. The units are really bad, and frankly, I don't want to play any of them. So I've tried in various shells, and basically the early game, turn 1, turn 2, have been so poor that even though you can get into like a pretty solid mid game, and then like a good green villain top end, it has some problems. Bosk Green, as you can recall, kind of solved this issue because it didn't need to play all the bad units. It just played the bounties instead, which were kind of like its early game. So certainly you can try looking at Darth Maul there. Nothing in the new set I think really fixes Bosk's issue of consistency, which kind of pushed it down for me a little bit. But in general, I would like to see Darth Maul explored with Energy Conversion Lab. In Defense of Camino, Clone Wars, this is just like a cool combo. I don't know if it's ever gonna, like, it looks incredibly slow and probably way too slow to ever be good, but maybe not, like, because there's a lot of power here, right? You make a bunch of tokens one turn, next turn all your tokens have heal 2, and when they die they make a new token, right? So it's just like a giant health board swing if you're able to set this up. All the droids that your opponent has don't really matter because your stuff's twice as big and it's all healing for 2 and dying into a new guy. So interesting little interaction to look at. Shadowed Intentions, it is a card that lets us be a little more all in. Obviously it prevents non-leaders from bounce, but mostly I think it's still like, even though a lot of this stuff like that can't be captured, can't be returned to hand, both of that is completely useless on a leader. But the important part is can't be defeated by effects. Like, you stick this on a leader and now the only way they can deal with it is through combat interaction. So you look at like something like Chariot with yellow, could just end up being invincible, or like Boba with Boba's armor, of course. But it's an interesting little thing that if we really want to go like heavy on a leader strategy, could be interesting. Satine, to me, not so interesting, but I think at the very least, you gotta keep this card in mind and see if like you can break it, because I don't think we can yet. I think it was built pretty safely, especially like giving your opponent the ability as well, being as expensive as it is and as like do nothing as it is to initially start. But this kind of effect can like delete a deck pretty quickly if like the world is different, if like the decks in the meta are different. So it's something to keep in mind. Reprocess, another really interesting card for grindy games. I think if we end up in a world where Satine, or even without Satine, like Vigilance and Milling become very popular, or even slightly popular, I think Reprocess could be a very interesting card to start including. It has like pretty good baseline power, just being able to like get 4 units out for 3 costs. So cool card. And then right next to it, Clear the Field, a card that would kill all those tokens, and a card that is going to kill all your tokens if you play a bunch of them. Clear the Field is very powerful. In a lot of cases, I think this might be a main deckable card, but at the very least, it could be sideboarded. It's very cheap bounce. You can play it on turn 1, right? So you just bounce their turn 1 play. You're down a card, but often that won't matter. The card's very strong and a very strong hoser for token strategies. So those looks like go wide with droids, go wide with clones. It's gonna be, if any of that is popular, it's gonna be heavily contained by this card. I think it is very powerful and something you got to consider and maybe even think about when you're talking and like building these go wide decks. All right, that's what I got. I hope this was helpful. This is kind of like the early dump of information for the next set, right? So we have to look at what happened in the previous set, start thinking about what we're targeting, the good stuff from the previous set. It's not going anywhere. It's all very, very powerful. And we have to see what can break through. But before we do that, of course, we have to know what it is we're targeting. And I hope that like separating the decks into like these pillars and talking about what specifically is super powerful about them and how you need to go about targeting them was helpful. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this. And until next time, take care.